They say the avoidant runs away from love, but what if that's not quite the whole picture? What if the avoidant isn't really running from another person at all, but from the unsettling reflection of who they could become in that person's presence? When a deeply empathic person enters their life, everything they've spent years burying starts working its way back to the surface. This isn't really a story about rejection, it's a story about internal conflict. What looks like obsession here isn't love in the ordinary sense. It's the psyche demanding real transformation. The avoidant personality gets misread constantly as cold, distant, or deliberately unavailable. But that emotional detachment isn't rooted in cruelty. It's a defense mechanism against the overwhelming experience of vulnerability. For the avoidant, the emotional world feels like a battlefield, one they've learned to sidestep rather than engage with directly. Somewhere underneath all that guardedness sits a wounded inner self, one that used to be open, expressive, and hungry for connection before betrayal, neglect, or emotional abandonment shut it down. That buried part of them doesn't vanish. It simply retreats into the unconscious, waiting. When the avoidant crosses paths with a deeply empathic person, what strikes them isn't just surface charm or ordinary attraction. It's a deeper, harder-to-name resonance. This empathic presence doesn't just show care in passing. They embody the exact qualities the avoidant lost touch with long ago: emotional fluency, openness, intuition, the ability to love without needing control or manipulation. These aren't simply appealing traits. They function as symbolic reminders of who the avoidant once was, or wished they could be. In this person, the avoidant senses a wholeness they can't quite put into words, and that creates a pull that's both thrilling and frightening at once. They're drawn in because something repressed inside them is being reflected back. And they resist, because getting closer means confronting the very pain that caused the repression in the first place. In the presence of this empathic person, the avoidant feels genuinely seen, not reduced to a role or a function, but recognized as a whole person carrying real wounds and complexity. That kind of attention stirs a dormant longing for real emotional intimacy, one they've spent years suppressing. The empathic person isn't forcing vulnerability out of them. Their presence simply invites it, which is exactly why it feels so dangerous to the avoidant. They want closeness, but closeness means exposure, and the very thing they need most, real connection, becomes the thing they're most afraid of. So they retreat, they pull away, go quiet, deflect, shut down emotionally. And yet the emotional world this person opened up for them doesn't disappear. It lingers, almost like a spiritual echo, resurfacing in dreams, stray thoughts, or the quiet moments when they're finally alone. They find themselves haunted by that emotional reflection because it offered a glimpse of a truer version of themselves. This is where the fixation actually originates. It isn't really fixation on the individual so much as fixation on the part of themselves that person awakened. The empathic person becomes an external symbol of the avoidant's lost emotional self, a mirror showing them not just what's missing, but who they were before fear took the wheel. This isn't a conscious choice. It's more like a psychic wound that refuses to close. The harder the avoidant tries to suppress it, the stronger it returns, because it's really the self-demanding recognition through the presence of the one person who made them feel something again. When contact happens between the avoidant and this deeply empathic presence, something well beyond ordinary attraction gets triggered. Underneath the surface detachment sits a hidden reservoir of unprocessed emotion, old trauma, unresolved inner conflict. The avoidant has spent years constructing a personality built to keep all of that suppressed, often coming across as aloof, overly rational, or fiercely independent. But this person's presence disrupts that structure in ways the avoidant can't fully control. They radiate emotional clarity and sensitivity, and those qualities reach the buried parts of the avoidant's psyche that have sat untouched in the unconscious for a long time. This isn't a surface-level connection. This person seems to see straight through the avoidant's carefully constructed walls, with a kind of intuitive clarity that feels almost unsettling. The avoidant grows restless, agitated, internally conflicted, not because anything is being done wrong to them, but because something is being done profoundly right. Their shadow is being activated. In psychological terms, the shadow refers to everything a person represses or denies about themselves, and for the avoidant, that shadow usually holds their emotional needs, their craving for closeness, their fear of abandonment, their buried longing to be loved. These get treated internally as weaknesses or threats and get pushed aside. But this empathic person surfaces exactly those qualities simply by embodying them so completely. Watching someone move through emotional depth with such ease, love without losing themselves, and meet pain with compassion instead of fear, forces the avoidant to confront the parts of their own psyche they've long disowned. That confrontation creates real internal chaos, sometimes surfacing as emotional flashbacks, confusion, or a sudden overwhelming urge to create distance. And yet, they can't stop thinking about this person. The reason is simple. The shadow has been stirred, and once stirred, it demands attention. The avoidance fixation isn't really about the person at all. It's about the psychological disturbance that person represents. This empathic presence becomes a living symbol of everything the avoidant now has to either integrate or keep running from. The fixation deepens precisely because this person unknowingly holds a kind of key to the avoidant's own emotional freedom. The more they resist it, the stronger the pull grows. None of this is intentional on the empath's part. It simply happens because their energy speaks directly to what's hidden, not what's actively denied. In this person, the avoidant sees someone who moves through the world with emotional honesty, who doesn't flinch from closeness, who holds space for pain rather than fleeing it. None of this registers logically for the avoidant. Their fixation isn't rooted in simple desire. It's rooted in an internal rupture. They feel destabilized not because they've fallen in love in the ordinary sense, but because they're being forced to face their own internal divisions. This person becomes both medicine and trigger at once. The relationship turns into a stage where the unconscious steps into the light, and once the shadow has been touched this directly, the avoidant can no longer retreat comfortably into emotional numbness without real psychological consequence. What unfolds between the avoidant and this empathic presence plays out almost like a symbolic meeting of opposites. One operates from detachment and self-protection, the other from deep emotional attunement and openness. It isn't merely a personality clash, it's a deeper psychological drama, opposing internal forces reaching for some kind of reconciliation. The avoidant typically fears emotional engulfment, associating closeness with potential harm or loss of self. The empathic person, by contrast, has built the capacity to feel deeply, sense beyond words, and hold emotional space without collapsing under someone else's weight. That contrast makes them almost an energetic counterpoint to someone unaccustomed to actually being felt, seen, or emotionally touched. Their coming together creates a tension neither fully understands, but both experience as something close to gravitational pull. That attraction is rooted in a genuine inner need present in both people. The empathic person, however strong and compassionate, often carries their own unconscious wounds from being emotionally dismissed or misread, while the avoidant carries the burden of having had to disconnect from their own emotional reality in order to survive. Their connection becomes, in a way, a reenactment of internal conflict. The empathic person naturally seeks harmony and emotional expression, while the avoidant instinctively retreats from that very depth. This stirs something primal in both of them. The avoidant feels simultaneously comforted and threatened, drawn to the warmth and safety on offer, yet terrified of losing control. The empathic person isn't drawn in out of neediness, but out of an intuitive recognition of the emotional depth hidden beneath that guarded exterior. This connection functions as more than just a bond. It's a symbolic effort by the psyche to reunite what has been split apart. The avoidant becomes fixated because this person represents something they have never allowed themselves to integrate. Emotional vulnerability, real intimacy, the ability to be held in someone else's presence without shame or fear. It was never really about the specific person, but about what that presence evoked. The avoidant sees in this person something they cannot generate within themselves, and so the pull becomes almost compulsive. It grows because it functions as the soul's cry for unity, the merging of the emotional and the intellectual, the relational and the independent, the open and the closed. That internal split cannot simply be ignored once it's been stirred. The avoidant, who often prides themselves on emotional control, discovers they are no longer fully in command. Their thoughts keep circling back, not purely from longing, but because their psyche has been touched at a depth they've never experienced before. This kind of relationship becomes a psychological container for transformation, confronting both people with their own unconscious patterns. But for the avoidant specifically, it exposes the fragility hiding beneath their emotional defenses. Without forcing or demanding anything, the empathic person becomes a bridge to the avoidant's divided self. And even if the avoidant eventually pulls away, the fixation lingers, because it was never merely relational. It's archetypal, a mirror reflecting the soul's quiet longing for wholeness. The avoidant doesn't handle emotional connection in a straightforward way. Their internal world runs on calculated distance, emotional self-protection, and unspoken rules built specifically to avoid the chaos of vulnerability. So when they encounter someone who sees straight through emotional barriers and responds with intuitive warmth, the avoidant instinctively starts testing the edges of that connection. These tests aren't conscious manipulation, and they aren't meant to cause harm. They're psychological strategies born from fear, confusion, and a desperate need to confirm whether the emotional safety being offered is actually real. The avoidant might suddenly pull back, go silent, turn cold or dismissive, all while quietly watching how the other person responds. These moments of withdrawal function as both a defense mechanism and, oddly, a kind of dysfunctional invitation, a way of testing whether this person is different from the ones who hurt them before. Because the empathic person is so attuned to emotional undercurrents, they typically respond with understanding, patience, and warmth rather than anger or neediness. That steady presence disorients the avoidant. They expect abandonment when they push people away, expect blame when they withdraw, anticipate rejection when their flaws show. But the empathic person disrupts all of that by staying grounded, which makes the avoidant watch even more closely. The fixation deepens, not simply from affection, but because this person becomes something genuinely rare, someone who doesn't punish emotional messiness, but instead makes room for it. That's completely unfamiliar territory for the avoidant. So they keep testing, not to cause pain, but searching for some kind of certainty in a world that has never felt emotionally safe to them. The more emotional endurance this person shows, the more curious the avoidant becomes. They start noticing that their coldness doesn't drive this person away, that their silence doesn't trigger immediate abandonment. That creates confusion, fascination, and a quiet reverence they don't fully understand. This person becomes a symbol of real emotional strength, not the dominating kind, but the kind that nurtures without becoming brittle. The avoidant is used to people crumbling under their emotional absence, yet this person stays centered. That resilience makes them something of an enigma. How does someone feel that deeply and still remain whole when others fall apart under similar emotional strain? As the testing continues, the avoidant becomes increasingly fixated, wondering who this person really is, how they hold such emotional steadiness, why they don't demand, chase, or collapse. The avoidant, who often operates on the belief that love has to be earned or maneuvered for, is unsettled by the notion that this person simply offers it freely. Their fixation turns into a kind of mental loop, constantly revisiting interactions, wondering what the other person is thinking, quietly checking whether they're still around. None of this gets expressed openly, but internally they are captivated. The testing isn't just about boundaries. It's about identity, about truth, about the unsettling question of whether real emotional safety actually exists anywhere in another human being. The avoidant often lives in a kind of emotional exile, keeping distance from others, not because they lack any desire to connect, but because closeness threatens the fragile stability they've built to survive. Intimacy reads to them as risk, something capable of exposing the deeper chaos they've worked so hard to keep suppressed. When this empathic person enters their life, the avoidant isn't just drawn to their warmth and depth, they become dependent on them in a way that bypasses conscious awareness entirely. Even after the relationship ends or gets disrupted, this person remains alive in the avoidant's mind, not as a passing memory, but as a persistent inner presence. The avoidant may keep moving through life outwardly, chasing distractions or even starting new relationships, but internally, this person becomes the emotional compass they keep returning to. Someone who usually navigates the world through detachment and logic finds themselves emotionally tethered to the one person who made them feel genuinely seen. This bond doesn't form through obvious attachment behaviors, but through the quiet, transformative power of emotional resonance. The empathic person never tries to fix the avoidant or demand they change. They simply accept them with quiet strength. That kind of unconditional emotional presence leaves a real mark. The avoidant starts comparing everyone else to that energy, wondering why new connections feel shallow by comparison, feeling dissatisfied even with someone who looks perfect on paper. What they're actually missing isn't the attention or affection itself, but the spiritual stillness that person offered, the sense that they could simply exist as they were without performing, defending, or retreating. This realization usually surfaces quietly, long after the person is gone. The avoidant replays old conversations, remembers what it felt like to be understood without needing to explain themselves, and sometimes starts unconsciously mimicking that person's way of relating to others. This fixation doesn't arise from anything the empathic person did deliberately. It arises from what their presence awakened. The avoidant slowly realizes that the emotional compass they've relied on their whole life, built on avoidance, self-sufficiency, and guardedness, simply stopped working. It brings no peace. It offers no satisfaction. This person represented a path the avoidant never let themselves walk, one built on openness, connection, and authenticity. And having glimpsed it once, everything else starts to feel flat by comparison. The internal compass shifts from detachment toward longing, not because the avoidant suddenly becomes emotionally articulate overnight, but because they now feel the absence of something genuinely real. That person becomes a kind of silent guide. Even in their absence, every emotionally charged moment triggers a quiet internal question. What would they say? How would they respond? What truth would they reflect back? The avoidant who once fled from emotional influence now finds themselves haunted by it. The old compass has effectively been replaced by a deeper intuition, one born in that person's presence that lingers long after they're gone. This kind of psychological anchoring is exactly what makes the fixation feel so inescapable, because it touches the very structure of how the avoidant orients themselves in the world. This fixation, in the case of an avoidant caught up in someone this deeply empathic, isn't simply about longing or regret. It's the outward expression of a much deeper internal rupture. Someone who has spent years mastering emotional distance doesn't expect anyone to actually reach the core of who they are. They build walls to protect themselves from pain, often without realizing those same walls also block out healing, connection, and any real chance at self-understanding. When this empathic presence enters their life, they don't force those walls down. They simply reflect them back with such gentle clarity that the avoidant starts feeling what they've long suppressed. Emotional tension builds inside them, and at first it registers as discomfort, confusion, maybe even resentment. But over time, it becomes something far more powerful, a longing they can't quite name, a hunger not for the person themselves, but for the version of themselves that came alive in that person's presence. This kind of fixation is really the soul's protest against fragmentation. It isn't romantic infatuation or simple neediness. It's the psyche crying out to heal the split between the performed self, the avoidant built for survival, and the authentic self buried underneath it. Through their emotional depth and steady presence, this empathic person becomes a bridge to that hidden self. The avoidant feels consumed by the memory because the experience exposed something essential, something too real to be forgotten, ignored, or replaced. They may try to suppress the thoughts, distract themselves, or pursue new relationships, but the echo of that moment of recognition keeps returning, pulling at them not from outside, but from somewhere deep within. In that sense, the avoidance fixation functions almost like a summons, the beginning of a psychological and spiritual shift they never consciously chose and don't fully understand. This person becomes a symbol of unrealized potential, the path toward wholeness that the avoidant unconsciously rejected in order to shield themselves from pain. But having had that mirror held up to them, having glimpsed what it feels like to be truly seen and understood, they can't simply return to the emptiness of disconnection without some cost. Their mind keeps replaying the memories, not out of nostalgia, but to preserve the one experience that ever made them feel fully real. The fixation is the psyche insisting that something within has to change, that what was once denied can no longer be ignored. In this way, the avoidance fixation becomes a doorway to something far bigger than simply reconnecting with another person. It becomes the first real movement toward inner integration, a painful but necessary step into self-awareness. This empathic person stops being just an individual and becomes, in effect, a catalyst. Through their presence, the avoidant caught a glimpse of a life not governed entirely by fear. And even if they eventually walked away, some part of them remains bound to that vision. The fixation is the lingering flame of that truth, still burning somewhere in the darkness of their fragmented sense of self, asking not for reunion with the other person, but for reunion with the lost pieces of themselves. The avoidant's fixation on this deeply empathic person was never really a desire for possession. It was a cry from the unconscious, a mirror held up to parts of themselves they long ago rejected, a painful reminder of a self they never let fully exist. Without forcing any change, this person becomes the catalyst for a genuine internal rupture, waking the avoidant up to emotions, fears, and truths they can no longer keep suppressed. In that presence, the avoidant caught sight of what wholeness could actually feel like, and even though they may retreat, the fixation remains, because the imprint of that emotional truth simply cannot be erased. In the end, perhaps this is the realization that changes everything. It was never only about the other person, not in the way the conscious mind first imagines. When we fall deeply into an emotionally transformative relationship, it is easy to believe that all of the intensity belongs to the person standing in front of us. We assume they are the source of every feeling, every awakening, every shift in our inner world. We tell ourselves that if only they returned, everything would make sense again. If only they chose us, the rest of our lives would finally settle into place. But the psyche is rarely that simple. Carl Jung observed that the people who affect us most profoundly often awaken something that was already waiting within us. They do not create an entirely new self. They reveal one that had been buried beneath years of fear, adaptation, and unconscious habit. The relationship becomes less like the creation of a new identity and more like the uncovering of one that had quietly existed all along. This is why certain encounters feel so extraordinary. They seem larger than ordinary attraction, larger than compatibility, larger even than romance itself, because something inside you begins to move that has remained still for years. You become more emotionally honest than you have ever been. You notice parts of yourself you never knew existed. You discover depths of tenderness that surprise you. You find yourself imagining a future that once felt impossible. You become willing to risk vulnerability in ways your former self would never have allowed. Naturally, the conscious mind concludes that the other person must be the source of all this transformation. But what if they were never the source? What if they were the catalyst? There is a profound difference. A catalyst begins a reaction. It does not become the reaction itself. The transformation belongs to the person experiencing it. The encounter simply revealed that transformation was possible. This is why, after relationships end, people often remain emotionally attached long after circumstances have changed. They believe they are grieving only the loss of another human being. Yet beneath that grief lies something more subtle. They are grieving the version of themselves that briefly emerged in that relationship, the self who laughed more freely, the self who believed more deeply, the self who felt courageous enough to love without calculation, the self who imagined life could become something larger than survival. Those experiences become intertwined with the memory of the other person until they appear inseparable. Yet over time, healing reveals a remarkable truth. That version of you did not disappear because the relationship ended. It returned beneath the surface, waiting not for another person to rescue it, but for you to claim it consciously. This is why people sometimes mistake longing for destiny. They believe they miss only the individual. In reality, they often miss the state of being that individual awakened within them. They miss feeling alive. They miss feeling emotionally present. They miss believing that change was possible. They miss recognizing themselves in ways they never had before. The relationship became a doorway, but the doorway is not the destination. Jung called the deepest movement of the psyche individuation, the gradual process of becoming the person you truly are rather than the person fear taught you to become. Relationships can serve this process in extraordinary ways because they illuminate both our greatest capacities and our deepest wounds. They reveal where we love generously and where we cling desperately. They expose the masks we wear and the authentic self waiting patiently beneath them. Seen from this perspective, The greatest gift another person may give you is not permanence, it is revelation. They reveal your capacity for intimacy. They reveal your unresolved fears. They reveal the places where your identity depends too heavily upon external validation. They reveal strengths you never knew belonged to you. And they reveal the life your soul has quietly been asking you to live. That is why the deepest attachment is often not to the person alone. It is to the possibility they briefly allowed you to glimpse. The possibility that you could become more whole, more honest, more courageous, more emotionally awake. Yet possibilities are invitations, not guarantees. An invitation can be accepted, it can also be ignored. Many people spend years chasing the person who first awakened that possibility, believing that reunion alone will restore everything they lost. But the unconscious keeps whispering a different truth. The life you glimpsed was never locked inside another human being. It was always growing inside you. The relationship simply illuminated it for a moment, like sunlight passing through a window, revealing dust that had always been floating quietly in the room. Another person's presence can illuminate parts of your own psyche that remained invisible until then. When the light moves, the dust does not disappear. It simply waits to be seen again. So perhaps the deepest longing was never for one particular person. Perhaps it was for the self that finally stepped out from behind years of emotional protection. The self who was capable of trust, the self who dared to hope, the self who discovered that vulnerability was not weakness, but the beginning of authenticity. That self still exists. It has not been taken from you. It has not been abandoned. It has not been left behind with someone else's departure. It waits quietly beneath every defense you built after disappointment, beneath every story that told you to become smaller, harder, or less open than your true nature. And that is where the final realization begins to emerge. It was never really the person they were fixated on. It was the version of themselves that briefly came alive when the walls fell away, the version untouched by constant self-protection, the version that no longer measured every word before speaking, the version that loved without hiding, the version that remembered what it felt like to live instead of merely defend itself. That is the self they continue searching for, even if they mistakenly believe they are searching only for another person. The tragedy is that many spend years trying to recover that feeling by returning to the same relationship, unaware that the true journey has always pointed inward. Because no relationship, however profound, can permanently preserve the self that emerges within it, unless that self is consciously chosen afterward. The walls may come down because another person made you feel safe, but lasting transformation happens only when you decide they no longer need to be rebuilt. That is the deeper invitation hidden beneath every meaningful encounter, not merely to find someone who awakens your authentic self, but to become someone who continues living as that authentic self, even when no one else is there to remind you who you are. And perhaps that is the quiet truth waiting beneath all the longing. It was never really the person they were fixated on. It was who they became when the walls briefly came down, and who they might still become if they finally stop running, not towards someone else, but away from themselves, and instead have the courage to remain present with the person they have been becoming all along.